Welcome to the Higher Ed Huddle, hot off the press podcast, where we bring you the latest higher ed news and stories twice monthly. I'm Joe Traino, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chase Goode. We are with BerryDunn's higher education management and IT consulting team. Chase, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Joe. How are you?
I'm doing good. Getting ready for the holidays. We had our podcast last. We did something new. We shook things up a bit and each shared a story for discussion. So I think we'll continue with that theme. That seemed to be kind of fun. So we'll start with you. And what story do you have to share with us this week?
Yeah, Joe. So the first kind of topic that I wanted to talk about, it's really a combination of stories, but they're all centered around NIL in higher education. And so for those that aren't aware, NIL stands for name, image, and likeness. And what it is it's a program that's been established by the NCAA for student athletes in 2021. And it allows athletes to be paid through different sorts of methods, whether that's through endorsements, cameos and appearances, autographs, merchandise, things like that, based on their name, their image, and their likeness. So previously, all athletes were considered to be amateurs if they were in college. And so they were not able to receive any sort of compensation for, their performance or their name, image, or likeness. And, of course, that led quite a few athletes to get paid under the table. And if they were caught, then that ultimately would lead to them, being expelled from the university. However, with NIL now in place, that allows athletes to be paid through these various mechanisms based on their performance and how they're currently, doing in their respective sports. So this is not just for football players or baseball players, basketball. This applies to all NCAA athletes. And, as it's been implemented, there have been a lot of changes that have happened over the course of the past year and a half. So really quick, just a high level, overview of kind of where some of these athletes, how much money they're making and what to expect. So the top 5 athletes, are currently all quarterbacks except for one. So number 1 is Bryce Young from the University of Alabama with a current valuation of $3.2 million. And he's getting paid $26,000 per sponsored social media post. Number 2 is CJ Stroud, who's the Ohio State quarterback. Again, $2.5 million valuation, about $17,000 per social media post. Caleb Williams was number 3. He's the quarterback from USC. Jackson Smith Njigba, who's a wide receiver from Ohio State. He's the only non-quarterback in the top 5. And then the final one is Bijan Robinson from University of Texas. Again, even at number 5, he's still valued at $1.7 million and about $17,000 per sponsored social media post. So quite a lot of money that these athletes are getting through various NIL deals. But it's important that even though you have some of the highest athletes coming from, these 4 schools, that's not necessarily the same, or it's not those schools that have the largest NIL reserve fund. So in terms of the schools with the largest amount of NIL money available, got Texas A&M at number 1, where the average athlete will make $85,000 a year in NIL endorsements, followed by Michigan, Oklahoma, Georgia, and University of Alabama coming in at number 5 at about $50,000 per athlete. So a really big question that people have been asking is, okay, so where is all this money coming from? And, there is a fair portion of it that's coming through, sponsored endorsements from specific companies and things like that. But an even larger portion is coming from alumni and what's known as collectives. So there was a recent report from Outkick that said, it kind of dove into the funding and how that can be used both positively and negatively to recruit student athletes to the university. So the fact is there are a lot of really high value high school prospects that are really just going to go to whatever school can pay them the most. And so with that in mind, there are a lot of concerns about it. So the schools themselves cannot be directly involved in the NIL process or funding. The University of Alabama can't say to a student athlete, we're going to pay you $5 million to come play here next year. However, you do have collectives that can go through various different means to ensure that these athletes are paid if they were to come to the university. So a collective is a group of sponsors or donors that pool together funds, typically cash donations that are not taxed and they're not tax deductible. And that goes into a reserve fund that's then paid out to the athletes accordingly. So again, there's a lot of concern about NIL, especially with some of the dollar values that are kind of being thrown out there. And so a response to this is kind of, where is all of this headed? People are really expecting, something to happen with NIL, because the way that it's currently working, you're really kind of playing with fire. So it's really interesting, because back in September, the Justice Department, the Justice Department reported that a senator from Mississippi has reenacted a piece of legislation called the Collegiate Athlete Compensation Rights Act. And basically, it's still preserving NIL. It's still keeping the concept intact. It's still allowing college athletes to be paid. However, it's putting a lot stricter regulations on those collectives so that the funds are managed appropriately, that it's taxed correctly, and it also addresses some of the more nitty gritty questions of, okay, say you're a student athlete and your uniform is Nike. Your school is sponsored by Nike. But if you sign a NIL deal with Under Armour, how is that going to work out? This is what that bill is hoping to address. So it's gaining support from both sides in Congress. It's still kind of going through the legislative process, but both Democrats and Republicans see the value in having, this legislation in place. And regardless of what happens with NIL moving forward, there needs to be some sort of federal regulations, because otherwise you'll see the system, continue to be abused or athletes put at risk in terms of their relationships with the collectives as well as the university. So I know that was a lot, but I am interested in hearing your perspective.
Wow.
Because, yeah.
There's a lot to unpack there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's so fascinating. It really is. I'm just thinking back to where did this all come from? Why was it something that had to be put in place, the NIL? And I don't have the background on that, but I think the regulation or the legislation to really regulate it a little bit more, just to put some standards around it or some rules about how it can be done, just to reduce the chances of abuse, I think are a good thing. But even before that, I don't know if I'm a fan of it, to be honest with you. I think the whole point of going to college and playing sports is to remain as an amateur and to play for a pride of your institution. And so paying students to play collegiate sports just doesn't feel right to me. I know others would argue about that, but that's kind of how I feel about it. I don't know. I mean, I think there are certain sports that will be able to, pay athletes using the NIL a little bit more than others. I mean, obviously football is huge for a lot of institutions. The collective thing is kind of interesting as well. So I don't know. Oh man, that's a big can of worms right there. And what about, athletes that don't get drafted, or, I mean, obviously the athletes that are in the top 5 are likely NFL, the example that you shared with the football players, I think are probably going to be playing professionally at some point. But, what about those athletes that are not able to get the endorsement deals? So I don't know. What are your thoughts on it? You played college sports, right? So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think first off, I am for the NIL. I think it's a really good idea, especially when you look at just the sheer amount of money that these college football programs, especially in your Power 5 conferences, what they're bringing in just on a single sport on a yearly basis. So, for example, the University of Alabama, last year they generated $33 million in revenue just from football. So it makes sense that some of that money is going to pay some of their athletes. However, I am really glad that you brought up the point about the athletes that might not be getting NIL deals, because what's been on my mind as thinking back to when I played sports in school was, if you have a player who, take Bryce Young, for example, he's the QB, he's the most valuable player on the team, some might say, and he's bringing in the highest paycheck on the team. But then you have other players, for example, his offensive linemen, who are out there, they're going to the same practices, they're, still really good athletes, and they have a good shot at playing in the NFL, but they're making a fraction, a slim fraction of what he's making. And so what I'm thinking is, how does that affect the camaraderie, the brotherhood on the team?
Yeah, the dynamics of
exactly.
The relationships.
Some might be looking at it and saying, if I'm not going to get paid this amount, then I'm not going to try as hard. And so what's the point of, paying your quarterback all this money if he gets hurt? And I could see, the issues with the collectives and the ability to tax these, the money that these athletes are receiving, that's something that can be handled with legislation. But the team dynamics is a whole nother issue, because how are you going to adequately coach a player who's making several $1 million a year in the same way that you're coaching somebody who's not?
Yeah, and probably making more than some of the coaches on the team, right?
Quite possibly, yeah. So I think it'll be really interesting to see what happens with the NIL, especially looking at, the next fall sports season, because I think some things are going to change, and especially now with the transfer portal opening up and all of the traffic that's getting, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that's a great story. I appreciate you bringing that up, and let's keep an eye on NIL as the year progresses. It'll be interesting to see what happens, what plays out. There's so many facets to that story. The impact to students, student athletes, to the team, camaraderie that you mentioned, the teamwork, motivation might be another one. What does that do to that? And, do you start doing the same thing in high school? I don't know. So yeah, it certainly is an interesting topic. That's for sure. So thank you. We'll move on to my story. So, I'm bringing a story that was a hot topic this week. There was a story in NBC News that I picked up on, and it was about a ChatGPT app, which was released a couple weeks ago, I think the end of November, and it went viral, and it has the potential to have implications in higher ed. And just for our listeners that don't know what ChatGPT is, according to Wikipedia, it's a prototype artificial intelligence chatbot developed by OpenAI. And the chatbot is a large language model fine-tuned with both supervised and reinforced learning techniques. It's garnered attention for its detailed responses and articulate answers, although its factual accuracy has been criticized. So, as most people likely know what a chatbot is, you ask it a question, and it provides a response. And so the reason I share this story today is that the NBC News story that was posted about ChatGPT was asking the question if this could inspire students to cheat, rendering current tools obsolete. So as most of us know, papers that you have to submit usually get scanned through a tool to see if there's anything that's been copied from previous papers or anything that's published out there. And the idea is that this chat GPT could potentially write a paper for a student using intelligence built into this AI and not be detected. And so some professors feel that this chatbot tool could be used to enhance education. There are others that feel that there's plenty of opportunity for collaboration between AI and educators. And so experts are not aware of any tools that can detect papers being written using AI, but predicts someone will capitalize on that technology to do so. It's still in the early stages, but I'm sure there will be more coming in the coming year. So I thought this was an interesting story, and I wanted to see what your thoughts are on it.
Well, yeah, I do think that is a really different way to think about ChatGPT. Speaking candidly, I have played around with it a little bit, and my experience has been relatively positive. I can completely understand the criticisms about its accuracy because, of course, with every kind of AI-driven tool, there's always going to be the potential for misinformation. When thinking about it in terms of cheating and whether a student would use it to actually complete an assignment or write a paper, I definitely understand the concern. But I think moreover, it's kind of the same old of if a student is trying to cheat, they're going to find a way to cheat, whether that's asking a friend to write a paper, whether that's finding something online or other various means. But, an AI tool that they can put in a prompt and, have it spit out an essay, that's definitely something you'd want to keep an eye on. I would be curious to see what are the more positive aspects of that. Could ChatGPT be used as a reference potentially? Could it be cited as a source? And, how could you ensure that the information that it's feeding you is 100% accurate and it is factual? So I definitely think that there's going to be systems or tools, methods in place to identify whether or not something was written by an AI tool or AI chatbot. If you can't tell, just by reading it, if it jumps out as, oh, that's not how, a typical human might write something, that would be one way. But then also kind of looking at the nuances behind each of those different AI tools, I think it'll be, challenging, but it is, if it does become a concern, it'll have to be addressed. But I don't know if that would be the go-to reaction from a student is, oh, I'm going to use a chat bot to write an essay.
Yeah, that's interesting. Good thoughts there. Yeah, I think it's too early to tell right now. I think there are more positives with AI for education than negatives. I kind of think back to the calculator. When the calculator first came out, there was probably a lot of criticism. Oh, now it's going to take away our ability to learn math. We don't need to learn math, and students are going to cheat, using a calculator. And, that wasn't true. So, I think it'll enhance our ability to learn. I think of Star Trek, when they talk to the computer and they ask it questions, maybe I think that's where we're headed. We have Alexa and Siri and, we'll ask it very basic questions and it'll provide information. And I think this will take it to the next level. And certainly that can be incorporated into teaching and learning in the classroom. And, it's interesting. I think education is changing. It's gonna, I think start shifting over the next 3 to 5 years. We're going to see just a whole new wave of methodologies and pedagogies. And it'll be interesting to see how AI is incorporated into that. I think VR was something that was kind of introduced maybe a couple years ago in education. They're using that now for a lot of teaching and learning. And AI, I think, is just another tool. And I think, worrying too much about the paper writing, I don't know. I don't think that's really that important, to be honest with you. I know that the writing piece is an important learning in education, but I think a lot of faculty are smart and they know their students, and if they see kind of a nuance or a change in their writing behaviors, they'll kind of sends a red flag, if you will. So I'm not too worried about that, but I certainly think there's more benefit to AI in the future.
Agreed. And then, in the same mindset of, oh, how would you think about grading something like this? If you were to use AI or an AI chatbot to help you write an essay, would you need to cite that in the same way that you could, essentially cite like a spell check or a Grammarly or a Perfectit. I mean, those are not necessarily the same, but it's the same concept. It's a tool that's helping you perfect your skills. And so it's one thing to plagiarize, but it's another thing to use it to make your own work better.
Yeah, I agree. Well, this was really good. 2 great stories again. I think we want to keep an eye on these two stories going forward. I think there'll be more we'll see. So good topics for us today, Chase. I'm looking forward to our next episode in a couple weeks. Actually, we'll likely record the next one in the new year. Thanks for listening to the latest news in higher ed. For our listeners, if you wish to read more about these items, please refer to our show notes for links to these stories. You can find our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and Google. Check back in 2 weeks for more higher ed news and stories. Until then, stay well, happy holidays, and we'll see you in the new year.